Empire by Brandon Sanderson, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, The Elder Scrolls by Bethesda, Warhammer 40k by Rick Priestley, and Alessio Cavator, The Promise by Gene Young, 1984 by George Orwell. Spoilers for the grand tale that is the arc of history, but every empire falls. They fall for a host of reasons: economic downturn, infighting, engaging in a land war in Asia, or going against a Sicilian when death is on the line. Like all of history, how empires fall is complicated, and as such, the discussion demands 4 parts: reality versus revolution, the 3 Cs, succession crisis, and repercussions. Reality and revolution. It is very easy to imagine your evil empire falling due to the glorious revolution of discontented lumberjacks and communist berry-pickers, but the reality is that empires usually fracture and decline slowly, over years, decades, or even centuries. The revolution only comes at the tail end of that period. The Western Roman Empire collapsed over 2 centuries due to a myriad of economic, military, and government problems we will discuss later in this part. The Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, rose and fell gradually over the next 1,000 years. The Mongol Empire fractured into 4 parts following a succession crisis, and then each section was slowly eaten away at by numerous small revolutions for a whole century. It took nearly 6 decades for the British Empire to break apart due to a shift against colonization in geopolitics. Even the Umayyad Caliphate, which was overthrown in the Abbasid Revolution, declined economically and politically for 2 decades before the actual revolution happened. When building an empire that falls to revolution, it is critical to keep in mind that it is usually preceded by a long period of economic instability, cultural fracturing, and a shifting political environment. In fact, these difficulties give momentum to a revolution, inspiring people to join the cause for personal and communal reasons. What is true is that the fracturing of an empire has often been found to be exponential. It breaks a little bit more, and then it breaks all at once at an escalating speed. Despite common depictions in film and television, the revolution does not usually come until the empire has reached a weakened state. If your story is about a revolution, it can help ground your story in a realism by showing the shift in economic well-being for everyday citizens. Seeing the empire struggle to maintain its border states, or to show the instability between factions in the government. A revolution does not spring from nowhere. These things show why revolution is possible now, but it was not before. The exception to this is short-lived empires, like Nazi Germany, which tend to collapse incredibly quickly. This is for a variety of reasons, but empires that rapidly expand tend to do so on a war economy that in a self-perpetuating cycle relies on the continual expansion of the empire. It does not have the internal economy or stability to sustain itself, and expansion can only go so far before it spreads itself too thin or gets battered back. Because of this, it eventually collapses, and it tends to do so quickly. One problem we have as writers is that this can make the empire feel like less of a threat. In Mockingjay, by Suzanne Collins, the capital loses virtually every battle against the rebellion from the very beginning, and is clearly at a weak point at the start of the revolution. The result is that it feels more realistic, despite the problems with narrative tension it creates. Recognizing this, Collins shifts the tension of the narrative away from whether the rebels will succeed against the capital to A, whether characters will survive, and B, the morals around the method of rebellion. Gale intentionally allows the deaths of children and civilians in hopes of victory, and Coyne desires retribution, wishing to punish the capital's children in vengeance. Think about the areas of your story that the reader cannot predict or will have strong opinions on, and develop those as driving points of tension in the narrative. They will invoke an emotional and intellectual response. Succession crisis. Kids will destroy anything a parent builds, including an empire. Imperial governments, especially at the start, are often heavily reliant on the legitimacy of a central living leader: Napoleon Bonaparte, Chief Palpatine, Sargon of Akkad, the Alexandrian members of history. 47 These are individuals that both the people, and those woven into the power structure of the state, like senators, lords, or khans, agree should embody the central government. Because of this structural dynamic, transfer of power to a new individual becomes a little more complex. Unclear successors. After the death of Genghis Khan, the uniting figure of the Mongol Empire, the legitimacy of that central authority began to slip. Eventually, Monkey Khan died in 1259 with no declared successor, leading to infighting between his sons, Kublai and Arik. Without Genghis, there was no agreement between the citizens of the empire, or those who could have been the next great Khan about who deserved the title, leading to the empire fracturing into 4 parts. From this point, the empire would progressively lose more territory. Within this, it is important to think about how your empire legitimizes its rulers. In G.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, the Blackfire Rebellion began when a king legitimized his bastard son and gave him the sword that was traditionally given to the heir to the throne, the sword of Aegon the Conqueror. Aegon is the founding father of the Seven Kingdoms as a single political entity. This action temporarily fractured the kingdom and led to numerous rebellions against the trueborn heirs. This becomes even more complex when that founding figure began the empire, meaning there is no precedent for how successors are chosen, or when that central figure rose to power in an unconventional fashion. For many, this is simply through right of conquest, but for others it can be through democratic election. If that central figure was elected as supreme democratically, then should their successor be elected as well, or should they choose their successor? Consider which traditions and symbols people recognize and respect in your world, and how they might weaken the empire during the transfer of power. Division amongst many successors. Some empires are purposefully divided between its numerous successors. This does not happen very often in fiction, but the best historical example of this is the Carolingian Empire. Louis the Pious ended up splitting his empire along lines that very roughly resemble those of France, Germany, and Italy. 48 though they were intended to be a cooperative political entity, without that central authority to unite all of the provinces as one empire, any political cohesion between the states quickly broke down, and the empire fell apart into its constituent states. This is because multiple people felt entitled to that mantle of authority, and it collapsed from infighting. Removal from power. No man is an island, and any ruler who does not understand this is not a ruler for long. The single, often absolute, ruler can be removed by the powers that keep them there. Sadly, in fiction, emperors, kings, khans, and supreme leaders often remain in power because the plot demands it, with little rationale behind it. In reality, emperors or these central authority figures are kept in power by a vast multitude of powers, generals, wealthy benefactors, parliamentarians, government officials, lords, barons, senators, and all others who have something to gain by keeping them there. In Avatar, The Last Airbender, Long Feng is the de facto ruler of Ba Sing Se. Long Feng, what's most important to His Royal Majesty is maintaining the cultural heritage of Ba Sing Se. All his duties relate to issuing decrees on such matters. It's my job to oversee the rest of the city's resources, including the military. Katara, so the king is just a figurehead. TBH, he's your puppet. Longfeng, oh no. His Majesty is an icon, a god to his people. He can't sully his hands with the hourly change of an endless war. It is the Earth King's trust in him that keeps him in power, but it is the Dai Li, the secret police, who enforce his will across the city. However, the Dai Li eventually choose to replace him with Azula, a Fire Nation princess they deem to be a better leader. In a humiliating scene, he orders them to attack, and they do not respond. With this, the Dai Li essentially choose a new, absolute leader. A similar instance can be found with the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, who often played a suspicious role in choosing the next sultan. Those that would undermine the influence of the Janissaries in political life were quickly expunged. Absolute power is never taken, it is given. If the tension in your story revolves around political drama during the fall of an empire, then these questions are particularly pertinent. 1. Who are the factions that keep the current power structure in place in your empire? 2. Why do they maintain the current setup of power? 3. What could motivate them to change their mind? However, the reason the removal of a leader so often contributes to the fall of an empire is the aftermath. Though the parties may agree to remove those currently in power, and there is no guarantee these parties will wholly agree, there is no assurance that they will agree on who should replace them or what kind of government system should come after. This is complicated by the fact that the successor is often chosen from amongst those parties who removed the previous rulers from power. For example, a lord or lady of a powerful house will often ascend to the throne. Members of the Roman Senate, Brutus and Cassius, removed Caesar from power with 23 democratic stabs to the chest, but their actions nearly fractured the empire when they threw it into the bloody liberators' civil war as people disputed which governmental structure should replace it. The revolution did not create an instant era of peace and prosperity for all. A succession crisis can come from having no clear legitimate successor. Having multiple legitimate successors, or the fallout of calling the legitimacy of the current ruler into question. The first causes conflict between those who could be the successor, the second destroys the important support of central authority, and the third causes disputes over which system of government should follow, and who should be a part of it. Within this, it is crucial to consider how power is transferred and legitimized. The Lord Ruler in Sanderson's The Final Empire avoids all of this by using the magic system to become eternally youthful, meaning the empire never faces the problems around the transfer of power because it always retains that central figure. Communication. In Part 15, we discussed how the 3Cs help an empire prosper and keep it working. Necessarily, if any one of these things are lost, then the empire is more likely to collapse. Losing communication structures can cripple an empire's capacity to coordinate and defend itself across its territory, as well as efficiently regulate its citizens and economy. In Warhammer 40k, a thing called the Astronomicon allows the Empire to commute and communicate across impossibly large galactic distances. It provides guidance for ships and messages by ensuring navigators can triangulate their course through the chaos of the warp base. This allows the Imperium of Man to govern across the galaxy and to coordinate men and resources around to respond to threats inside and out. In a cataclysmic event called the Noctis Aeterna, the Empire lost access to the Astronomicon. Planets became isolated, and the Imperium lost its ability to contact and assist those who needed it. Whole planets were slaughtered, and some planets tried to exercise their newfound independence without the direct oversight. The whole Empire virtually fractured for a period and had to be entirely reforged. Interestingly, the inverse of this can also contribute to the collapse of an empire: too much communication between citizens. For the most part, the original colonies in the Americas were relatively separate entities, and they communicated mostly through trade, rather than official networks. With increased networking, and the first mailing system, it was not just each colony communicating with the Crown in Britain independently anymore, but the colonies were communicating with each other. On the road to revolution, as the Americans 49 opposed taxes and tariffs, this network meant they could coordinate resources and men to put up an effective effort in rebellion. 50 alone, each colony was doomed, but through increased communication between citizens, they became more likely to develop a mutual cultural identity, and more able to secede from the British Empire. Control. An empire does not fall just because it loses its emperor. It falls when it loses the methods of control we discussed in Part 15. Terror, propaganda, self-governance, preferentiality, or assimilation. Losing these means losing taxes, resources, commerce, members of the military, coordination, and the ability to easily move forces through a given region. It is that which causes the downfall of an empire. In Orwell's 1984, Winston begins to see through the state propaganda designed to make him want to be part of Oceania, and fear those living outside of the state. He is brought to this epiphany through reading books. No longer believing the propaganda, he begins to make moves for revolution. In the story, this fails horribly and ends in him betraying his one companion, Julia. But it does raise an interesting point. Effective state propaganda is largely dependent on the state being the primary source of truth and information about the well-being of the nation and the outside world for citizens. In writing How Your Empire Falls, consider how connected citizens really are and their reliance on the state for the truth of the world. This also means that failure of propaganda is a lot more likely to play a part in the fall of science fiction empires, where technology makes it a lot easier for citizens to communicate ideas to one another. In contrast, in medieval worlds it is a lot easier to imagine that an ordinary citizen's only source of information about the rest of the empire is provided by the occasional traveler and the government. They have nothing to compare it to. The degree of centralized power in an empire is crucial to its formation and survival, and naturally it will play a role in how it collapses. Extreme measures of domination can be vital to establishing control in a region at the start of an empire. Political theorists like Machiavelli in The Prince say as much, but it can become a detriment in the long run, especially during peacetime, where the demand for a centralized government in the eyes of the citizenry becomes less obvious. The Qing dynasty in China collapsed due to its extremely centralized power. It increased the power of the central state with its legalist philosophical approach, attempts to impose a standardized culture, use of harsh punishments, focus on large industrial projects, military expansion, and leaving the local issues of the states unresolved. Naturally, people felt wholly alienated and dominated. This led to revolts and the dynasty's eventual collapse within 15 years. The flaws of centralized power have led the Roman Empire, Mongol Empire, and figures like Alexander the Great to decentralize a lot of their administrative authority. However, empires are fickle things, and divesting too much power from the center can also contribute to the downfall. The provinces start wondering, wait, why are we paying taxes to this dude with a crown that doesn't do anything? This was part of the reason the Chinese Zhou dynasty fell. It was so decentralized that its power was dwarfed by that of the surrounding three states of Qin, Qi, and Chu. Power slowly divested in its declining years, with each state essentially having its own military structure and managing its own agricultural sector, two powers that are usually reserved for the central authority because of the vital part they play in maintaining control. Soon enough, the empire broke because there were no teeth behind that central power. While building a collapsing empire, you might consider which powers the central authority need to maintain control, and which powers it is losing, weakening its ability to assert itself across its territory. A unified military is usually the most basic and obvious power, but there are more nuanced and less obvious, but just as vital, powers related to the economy. Which critical historical powers arise out of your fictional world? What happens if it gives up the power to tax a vital resource, produce a certain advanced kind of technology, or hands over the power to run the wizarding education system to its regions? This could mean the states become richer and able to compete with the central authority, or it could result in groups of mags loyal to the states rather than the central authority. Every empire will be underpinned by different fundamental powers, and you can make your empire stand out as unique by demonstrating what these different powers are and the impact of losing them. Holding together a vast range of people groups with different cultures, traditions, and languages is a difficult task, and one method to deal with this is giving the empire a unifying culture. In other words, stability through assimilation. This can range from the brutal suppression of native languages and cultures, like what happened under the British Empire to Maori in New Zealand, to unifying cultural practices like the Colosseum in Rome. In the waning years of the Roman Empire, a number of Germanic tribes were absorbed into the empire, but the old strategies used in the empire's height to help foreigners assimilate into a single military, single culture, and single citizenry were largely abandoned. This led to a constituent militant group the empire depended on who didn't truly think of themselves as part of the empire as a people group. This all fed into the natural conclusion, the fall of Rome. You can divide assimilation methods into two types. 1. Positive assimilation. This is where unifying cultural practices are added to the lives of foreigners to help them identify with the culture of the empire. 2. Negative assimilation. This is where the culture of the foreigners is discouraged to make them not identify with their original culture. Either attempting to change the culture of a people to fit the empire too much or doing so too quickly can result in that region of the empire fracturing. It can be better to die your own person than live as someone else wants you to be. Secession in a chain reaction. It is not uncommon for the secession of one people group to spark the secession of others around them. This was what happened with the late Khanates. As these peoples saw others around them rebelling, they wished to reassert control of themselves too. They never truly assimilated into the Mongol Empire, because the empire never heavily attempted to undermine their original culture or encourage identification with Mongol culture. This is also what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Western states of the Union seceded in rapid succession after detecting weakness in Gorbachev's central authority. Within the space of 13 months, 8 states had seceded. Within 2 years, all 25 states had taken their independence. Preferentiality. Fundamentally, these all come down the most important thing an empire needs, preferentiality, or making it preferable for a person to be a citizen of your empire rather than outside the empire. This is done through allowing self-governance, assimilation, propaganda, terror, and otherwise. A great example of preferentiality contributing to the fall of an empire is Elswey in the Elder Scrolls. The Khajiit of Elswey heavily depend on the moon culturally and religiously. When the 2 moons of Nirn, Massa and Secunda, vanished in what became known as the Void Nights, it was chaos. For the Khajiit, it meant a severe economic downturn, political turmoil, and widespread panic. Their faith in the Cyrodiilic Empire to preserve their way of life waned. Why should these men in a far-off land hold authority when they could not help protect them from the real threats? In contrast, the Aldmeri Dominion claimed responsibility for bringing the moons back some years later, leading to a wave of support for Khajiit to join the Dominion. They preferred to be part of the empire they felt could protect them. In circa 7 FE, they seceded from the Cyrodiilic Empire, contributing to its collapse. People will prefer to be part of the empire for different reasons: economic opportunity, religious freedom, security, protection of their way of life, and others. Consider how the events of your story affect the personal motivations of your characters, how they change them, and how widespread that change is. A region won't secede because one person feels their way of life is threatened, but it might if a large group feel that way. Commerce. Alas, the lifeblood of any state, empire, or anarcho-syndicalist commune that takes turns where each person gets to act as an executive officer for the week, commerce. Economic disaster is almost an historical constant prior to change in a government system, either violently or peacefully. This is at 2 levels. 1. The government having no money. 2. The people having no money. One of the advantages of an empire that helps them function and makes them wealthy is how interconnected and free their trade is. A wider variety of goods can be exchanged at more competitive prices. But this interconnectivity is a double-edged sword because of a concept called economic contagion. The economic prospects of more people are intertwined, meaning collapse in one place has more widespread consequences. But how does this economic downturn happen? It is a vicious cycle. An unstable economic climate means lower business confidence. Lower business confidence means people save more than they spend. People saving more means less money is cycling through the economy, and that leads to a more stagnant and unstable economic climate. All of this leads to an unhappy populace and eventual economic collapse. By the time the Byzantines fell, they had lost the capacity to finance their defenses, buy enough food during famines, and repair government buildings. In a show of historical irony, they could not afford to hire the very mechanic who invented the cannons that would be employed against them by Mehmed I in the fall of Constantinople in 1453. At the same time, tensions were high, with the populace erupting into regular riots against the powers that be. The effects of economic downturn are both internal and external. 1. Instability makes people more likely to revolt or secede, increasing the likelihood that the empire will collapse internally. 2. It lowers government revenue, preventing the empire from defending its borders, increasing its likelihood it will collapse externally as outside powers encroach and regions secede. This in turn reduces faith in the empire. Disease. Let us talk about the one thing empires expect less than the Spanish Inquisition: disease. The Roman Empire fell for dozens of complex political and social reasons, but it was undermined in its final centuries by 3 different intercontinental pandemic events: the Justinianic Plague, the Antonine Plague, and the Plague of Cyprian. This massive loss of life meant losing commerce and trade as people fled urban centers that would usually be hubs for the economy. It also made communication networks a lot slower, and for a time it shrunk the military, making the empire less capable of defending its borders. This weakened the faith of the people in the empire. If you are looking to distinguish the fall of your science fiction empire from others, an intergalactic pandemic that eviscerates its economy, communication networks, and governmental structures may be one way to go. Authors tend to relegate effects of disease to history or fantasy, but microbial pandemics are far from irrelevant. You may be sick of hearing how antibiotics are becoming less and less effective due to overuse, but this is a legitimate health concern that leaves us vulnerable to a super-evolved virus from space inevitably fated to kill all humans. Or just a normal virus. Up to you. Repercussions. 51. Any story that depicts a wholesome and peaceful dissolution of an empire is lying to you. It is spitting in the face of reality because humans might be great, even fantastic, at agreeing that government is just terrible, but we are really not good at agreeing on what to do after we take down the government. The sudden collapse of any empire, whether it be malevolent or not, has repercussions. What happens to its colonies? What happens to the people relying on its social welfare system? The collapse may dismantle things people oppose, but it also dismantles support systems society relies on. The story The Promise by Jean Yarn deals with the aftermath of the Fire Nation's 100-year empire building. The Earth Kingdom wants Fire Nation citizens gone, and the land returned to their jurisdiction, while the Fire Nation believes they need to protect the people who have lived there for generations, even if their ancestors went there initially in a colonization effort. These tensions lead to a skirmish, an assassination attempt on Fire Lord Zuko by one of his own citizens, implied racially motivated pogroms, and the dissolution of the Harmony Restoration movement. Whether an empire collapses from incompetence, revolution, or rapid secession, the vacuum afterwards often leads to a horrific power struggle both locally and centrally as people vie for what they feel would work best. The French Revolution was built on the ideas of liberalism, democracy, equality, and opposition to arbitrary power, but it ended up with Napoleon, an autocrat just the same as the monarchy in the wake of a bloody and chaotic overhaul of the political system of France. Panem in Collins's The Hunger Games is essentially an empire, and Katniss kills President Coin when she realizes she will bring about a new retributive reign against those in the capital, continuing a cycle of violence. Vengeance and retribution, and very much motivations for those who want to do away with an empire. Consider how these ideas play into the aftermath, especially if major characters have had these as part of their motivation in your story. You cannot simply have them forget and move on when they finally get their chance for it. Stories that center around the fall of an empire have a tendency to take the hive mind approach to galactic empires, that all the rebellion needs to do is kill the person wearing the shiny crown at the top of the evil pyramid wielding the pointy stick of Gulagish authority. The reality is more complex. Removing the head, per se, of the empire does not necessarily mean an empire will collapse. Umar is one of the most influential caliphs in Islamic history, and was ruler of the Rashidun Caliphate for a decade, but even after his assassination, the empire took up a new successor and continued to expand and prosper. Remember our discussion on removal from power. Oftentimes, a member of that ruling class will simply step up into the role, as a revolution rarely succeeds without assistance of some members of that class. Huge sprawling empires across continents, galaxies, or dimensions will persist so long as they maintain networks of control, communication, and commerce, even if they have to change and adapt to survive. A rebellion does not just have to kill the person who currently controls the empire, they have to destroy the empire's ability to control in the first place. Summary. 1. Empires usually fracture slowly, over decades or centuries, and where they are overthrown by revolution, this is usually preceded by a period of political and economic instability. However, they also fracture exponentially, one region's secession sparking the secession of others at an accelerating rate. 2. Succession crises create political instability that often leads to civil war and destroys the political cohesion needed for an empire. This is often due to uncertainty in how power is transferred and legitimized. 3. Losing communication networks, or too much communication between citizens, can undermine central imperial authority. 2. Aggressive assimilation, or too much or too little centralized power, causes states to rebel or secede, collapsing the empire. Consider which powers the central authority maintains, and which it gives up, leading to its collapse. 4. Consider why people groups prefer to stay in the empire, and what story events change these motivations. Loss of commerce means higher unemployment, lower living standards, and increased likelihood of revolt. It also decreases government revenue, preventing it from fulfilling its duties, lowering faith in the empire. 5. Disease can cripple communication, control systems, and commerce. 6. The aftermath of a fallen empire is complex. Factions will fight for who should be in control, and the regions will have to adapt without those central government networks that it may have relied on. Part 17. How I plan a novel. Planning a novel is hard. Which elements should you work out first? Bertolt Brecht might tell you that theme comes first, with art being a vessel unto meaning. Tolkien, often called the father of modern fantasy, began his works in designing the Elvish language. Mike DiMartino and Brian Konietzko brought their characters of Aang, Momo, and Appa to life before they found a setting for them, because ultimately, the reader experiences the story through them. David Leviathan, author of Every Day, writes out a plan half as long as the novel itself before going through to write it all out in full. There are dozens of methods people use to plan novels, and hundreds of structural techniques one can utilize to give their story shape, but there is almost no universal rule determining how you should plan a novel. With this in mind, this part will simply explore how I personally plan a novel, why I use this method, and its advantages. This way, you can decide whether it is a useful structural method for you. 52. Gardeners and Architects. G.R. Martin, author of the acclaimed A Song of Ice and Fire series, once described two broad types of writers when it comes to planning: gardeners and architects. I think there are two types of writers, the architects and the gardeners. The architects plan everything ahead of time, like an architect building a house. They know how many rooms are going to be in the house, what kind of roof they're going to have, where the wires are going to run, what kind of plumbing there's going to be. They have the whole thing designed and blueprinted out before they even nail the first board up. The gardeners dig a hole, drop in a seed and water it. They kind of know what seed it is, they know if they planted a fantasy seed or mystery seed or whatever. But as the plant comes up, and they water it, they don't know how many branches it's going to have, they find out as it grows. It is a spectrum between gardener and architect, not a dichotomy. I used to fall more on the side of the gardener, and my experience with that method led me to become more of an architect. When I was a lot younger, I would start writing a book without a strong idea of where I was going to end up with the characters, the story, or a theme. I had a vague idea, perhaps, but it was ever evolving as I wrote. The book would meander its way to completion, and then I would go back and revise the story for what felt like an eternity. Needless to say, I never finished any book using this method. This was due largely to my general inexperience. The motivation and skill to finish a novel only came with a great number of failures, but it was also due to the difficulties that come with the gardener approach. What I found was that because I had no clear endpoint